Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last session, session 7 of just this Genesis study. I thank you for joining me just throughout the entire course of just this study, looking at the book of Genesis. This is the last week, and so hopefully you have read most, if not all, of the book of Genesis up to this point. And so normally I would show you a reading schedule, but there is none. This is the last week, so hopefully you have kept up with that. If you have not gotten to read the entire book of Genesis, I would encourage you to do so. Having watched all of these sessions, either reread some parts, reread what you like, what you may have skipped because there was some stuff I did not have you read, or just kind of read it again. There's so much that we can learn just every time we read, but we are going to look at the last couple chapters today, Genesis 44 through 50, looking at the second part of Joseph. We left off with his brothers kind of coming back. We're going to look at how Joseph reveals his identity to them today. And so just this section, especially today, is going to deal with forgiveness. Kind of in light of the forgiveness we give and receive from each other, but more importantly, what I hope you see today is the forgiveness that we receive from God. This idea of grace, of unmerited favor, that God forgives us when we absolutely do not deserve it. So the two questions are very simple as you see them there. How have you been forgiven, and who can you forgive? We're going to look through just Joseph and how he forgave his brothers when he could have chosen a lot of other punishments for them. What I would encourage you to do is, as we go through, especially the second part, make this personal, because this is supposed to be personal. That how God works through Joseph and how Joseph treats and forgives his brothers is this idea of how God forgives us. And so we have to understand that. And I will say that outside of the cross of Jesus, I think this is one of the greatest examples of forgiveness we have in the Bible. So make this personal to you about who has forgiven you, and also who you can forgive, and what that looks like. So let's go ahead and get started. When we left off last time, Joseph was sharing a meal with his brothers, and gave Benjamin, the youngest son, a portion that was 5 times larger. Just this idea of what are the brothers going to do, and how are they going to respond to jealousy this time. So Joseph has put his silver cup in the youngest son's bag, in Benjamin's bag, as they're heading, kind of going to head back home. And he tells this story, basically, go catch up to them and ask them, why have you repaid evil for good? Isn't this the cup that my master drinks from and uses for divination? So divination was kind of this process of receiving knowledge from supernatural powers that is outside of God. It is not formally condemned, but I think we can see why that is wrong. That Joseph has already declared, even through the dreams, that it is knowledge that comes from God, and it is only the hidden knowledge that only God can reveal to us. And so he is the source of all things and the greatest being. So we should not seek to grasp knowledge outside of him, because there is no knowledge that exists outside of him. And so divination was a common kind of cultural thing. And so Joseph kind of uses this as a threat, this idea of the cup of divination, rather than actually practicing it. I just referenced it, but with the dreams, Joseph has gone on record for saying, it's not I who can really do anything for you, but it is the Lord who will give Pharaoh the answers to his dreams. He knows that divination comes from the Lord. So it is in Benjamin's sack. So basically the steward catches up. The brothers, who think they have not taken it, they're like, we don't have it. It says, if it is found with one of us, your servants, he must die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. And so this kind of goes back to Jacob and Rachel with Laban, where Rachel kind of sits on Laban's idols. Jacob's like, look, I don't have it. If you find it here, you can kill who took it. Not knowing that it was the favorite. It was Rachel who had stolen it. So Jacob, I think if he had known, would obviously not kind of sacrifice his favorite wife. In the same way here, if the brothers knew it was Benjamin who had the cup, there's no way they would say this because they know they need to take Benjamin back home. The steward says basically, now just the one who has the cup will be our slave, my slave, and the rest of you will be blameless and y'all can go back home. Right? This idea that they could be blameless is kind of radical because we have the outside perspective of the story. They would absolutely not be blameless if they lost Benjamin. They swore themselves to Jacob that Benjamin would return home. And so it is this very ironic, and you're going to see kind of, I think, the anxious state of the brothers start to kick in a little bit. Because the cup is found in Benjamin's sack. And as the brothers are before Joseph, they fall to the ground, and Joseph says to them, didn't you know that a man like me could uncover the truth by divination? Right? He refers it again. This is absolutely not his confession to using divination. He did not try to seek things outside of the Lord. It was a threat. But I also think, as kind of we'll see, the brothers previously have not picked up on any spiritual hint that Joseph has given them. So I think this is Joseph's attempt to kind of tap them into the divine. This idea of divination, they would understand there's obviously a connection to the divine. It's the root of the word. But this idea of uncovering truth by the divine is going to tap the brothers into this spiritual side. So when Joseph reveals his identity and the forgiveness that we're going to see, they know it's going to be the God of Joseph that is kind of pushing this forward. So I think this is Joseph's witness to the Lord. Right, the brothers respond. Basically, how can we plead? What can we even say at this point? Right, God has exposed your servants' iniquities, right, their sins, all their wrongdoings. And Joseph says, right, the man who is in my possession, or whose possession the cup was found, will be my slave. The rest of you can go in peace to your father. Right, Joseph, I think, knows, and would have this understanding of, right, because they didn't come with Benjamin the first time, that Jacob's holding on to Benjamin because he loved Rachel, and they think Joseph is dead. So him saying, like, you have to bring the youngest one, and honestly sending them back without the youngest one, say, well, y'all can go in peace. The brothers would not go in peace. They would go in everything but that, because they would literally be going back to their father to break their father's heart because they don't have Benjamin. And so kind of after this, right, Judah says to Joseph, right, this idea of, once again, divination, we're tapping into the divine and stronger spiritual forces of the world, right, that he is like Pharaoh. Yes, Joseph is the second in command to Pharaoh, but this idea that Joseph is serving Yahweh, the Lord, the God of the Israelites, and compares him to Pharaoh, is kind of twofold of recognizing the power of Joseph, but it's also, I think, giving us this foreshadowing language to what we're going to see in Exodus. Because Joseph, in this part, the story of Joseph is wrapping up Genesis, and it's also pushing us into the book of Exodus. And so we're going to see this because, I mean, the Exodus is most notable for the Exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, but it's the battle of Yahweh and Pharaoh. So Pharaoh was the kind of like the divine incarnated son of God to Egypt and the people who followed Egyptian religion. And so Exodus 5:2, I have it there that it's when Moses goes, or so earlier at the burning bush, Moses asks God, like, what do I tell him your name is? And he says, Yahweh, that you will be like God, and Aaron will be kind of the spokesperson. And Pharaoh says in Exodus 5, who is this Yahweh that I should even obey him? Like, why should I even care about the name of Yahweh, those who come in the name and representation of Yahweh? So it's all going to be this battle of the name. And I think when Joseph is trying to do the work of the Lord, his brothers are like, well, you look like Pharaoh. So I think it is kind of twofold. That language just kind of is going to connect us and come back up in the book of Exodus. But they do recognize that basically saying we have an elderly father, younger brother, the child of his old age. The boy's brother is dead. He is the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. Right? He had a wife, Rachel, who he loved very much, obviously more than anybody else. Joseph is dead. The younger one's the only one left. And they actually go on to say that his life is wrapped up with the boy's life, meaning Jacob's life is connected to Benjamin, that if the boy's not brought back, he will die. He will go down to Sheol in his sorrow. They're just repeating the words of Jacob. Last time we looked at when Jacob said, like, if I don't have my sons, I have nothing, and you're going to send me down to Sheol in my sorrows. Chapter 44 wraps up with this, with the brothers saying, Judah specifically saying, I could not bear to see the grief that would overwhelm my father. They finally, I think, understand he will actually die if Benjamin's not returned. And that launches us into Genesis 45. So it's important to know that, like, when the Bible was written, there were not chapter numbers or verses or chapter headings. They obviously help us a lot, but right, these would be read kind of in sequential order, just one right after another. And I do think that's kind of how we need to read this, because the first verse we get is Joseph could not keep his composure. Joseph, the last time we looked at when Joseph wept, it was because his brothers, I think, realized kind of what they did, and they were starting to express their guilt for doing this. And also because Reuben, the oldest, had basically vocalized his intention to come back and save Joseph, that Joseph was overwhelmed by the brother's guilt and the one brother's plan to actually save him, that this is the same thing. The brothers are finally understanding we have to protect each other. We have to protect our family and our father. And so I think those two things are why Joseph is losing his composure, and he can't really keep it together. And so then nobody else is present. He kind of clears it out. So it's just him and his brothers. And he reveals his identity. He says, I am Joseph. Right, is my father still living? But the brothers could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Joseph said to his brothers, please come near. And they came near. I am Joseph, your brother. He said, the one you sold into Egypt. Now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. This intimate moment between Joseph and his brothers is how personal it gets with God and I, God and us. That we experience the name and the identity of God as revealed to us if we are willing to get kind of behind closed doors with nothing else and nobody else present. This personal moment that we have is when we really start to see what is being done on our behalf. The brothers in this very moment are going to experience the presence of their brother, the work of God, right, and the forgiveness that comes from both. We will experience that if we are willing to step aside, go behind a closed door, and spend some quiet time with the Lord. Right, Joseph reveals his identity, and the brothers are terrified. Right, this is kind of the story of the Israelite people in the book of Exodus. Right, Yahweh reveals himself to Moses, leads them out of Egypt, and I mean the rest of the book of Exodus is about how scared the Israelites are to come into the presence of God. But this language is very, very similar. He basically says, right, I am your brother, right? Come near to me, right? And then repeats it again, I am Joseph, your brother. Right? When we see the progression of God revealing himself to Moses, to the Israelite people, right? He says to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, right? When Moses says, what is your name? Who sent me? Right? He says, I am that I am. Yahweh is like the root that we see it literally translates to he is in Hebrew with verb patterns and root changes and stuff like that. But right, so it just says I am Joseph. Right, what God says Moses is the I am Yahweh. Right, and James chapter 4 gives us this promise of draw near to God and he will draw near to you. That is what Joseph is saying, like, brothers, come near to me, right, for I have already drawn near to you. Right, it is through God that I'm actually standing here. It's through God that Jesus incarnates, because he is God, draws near to us so that we can draw near to him. And this last part of I am Joseph, your brother, right, when God says I am Yahweh, your God. I am Yahweh, the God who led you out of Egypt. I am Yahweh, right, the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right, all of these languages are about knowing the name of God. In this very moment, right, names are connected to identity. And so when Joseph reveals his name, he's revealing his identity to them in the same way that when Yahweh reveals his name to Moses and to us, he is revealing his very identity. Right, and this last part is the faith and perspective I think we all wish to have. Of God sent Joseph ahead of the brothers to establish them as a remnant within the land and to keep them alive for a great deliverance. It was not them who sent him there, but rather God. This language goes back to Genesis chapter 9 and 10, when the flood had receded and Noah and his family was preserved. A remnant is like a small survival group in a way. It's probably the easiest way just to explain it. So Joseph was preserved to keep the people as a remnant for a great deliverance that will come. That will be the Exodus. This small group of Israelite people, I mean, Joseph is the Israelite in Egypt right now. And we're going to get to the land and how he's going to preserve them in the land. But it's all to a small group of people, one person, right, is going to keep the hope for humanity alive. Right, for Noah, Noah and his family were literally the only humanity left at that point after the flood. So Noah's family, Noah specifically, was preserved as a remnant to preserve life, because they preserved the just existence of humanity on earth. This is the same thing with Jesus. All right, God sent Jesus ahead of us. We live in a post-resurrection world, right? Jesus incarnated 2,000 years ago. Right, we are living as the result of that remnant, both in the here and now, like physically on earth, but also eternally, right? That Jesus has gone ahead of us to preserve life, to establish us as, right, those who eternally survive and live, right, within the land, within the promised land of heaven, or the new heaven and the new earth, right, and to keep us alive by a great deliverance. Right, we only have life through Jesus, through the resurrection of Jesus. Right, and therefore it was not us who sent him here, but God. Right, it was God who incarnated himself through Jesus. It was not the brothers who led Joseph on this trip, but it was all under God's orchestration. The idea of Joseph and Jesus being connected, right? It's this idea that an anointed one goes into suffering, then to a place of glory, so forgiveness is made possible. Right? Joseph did it. He was the anointed one we saw from the dreams. He goes into suffering, into Egypt, into prison, redeemed to a place of glory with Pharaoh, so that forgiveness is made possible for his brothers and all of that. All right, Jesus is the anointed one that goes into suffering on the cross, goes into death, is redeemed to a place of glory, sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. So our forgiveness is made possible. We'll talk about this a little later on. It comes up again. And so after Joseph reveals, right, his identity, and he tells him, right, return to my father. This is what Joseph said. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Right, come down without delay. You can settle in the land of Goshen, and there I will sustain you. Goshen is a fuller root form of Gon, which means garden. And so Joseph here is going to sustain and provide for his brothers. We're going to dive into kind of what Goshen means here very shortly, because this is the first mention of it, but and very soon we'll get a couple more details about the land of Goshen. Right, but Joseph, as he sends them away, right, they're given, right, changes of clothes, but to Benjamin, he gives 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothes, and 300 pieces of silver. Right, it is this final test of the youngest brother that is with them, the one that Jacob loves the most. They're going to have a chance to not allow him to return home. They have a chance to kill him like they did, or they thought they did, to Joseph. All right, will jealousy kind of rear its head again, and will they kill their brother in the fields? Right, or, and this is the question we need to ask, this is why it's so important that this gets personal, does the forgiveness of God really mean something? Because they understand their guilt, and Joseph says, don't worry about it. It was God. Right? I have survived. It was God who led me through all of this. We're good. They just experienced that forgiveness that they don't deserve. Does that change something? Or do they abuse that and just go right back full circle, and we end the story where we start with them trying to kill their brother? Does the forgiveness of God really change something in our hearts, that we do repent, we turn around, and we walk in new direction with a changed mind? Or do we just abuse it and simply return to the same style of life, the same patterns of thinking, and the same disobedience? It's a crucial question that the brothers have to answer. We're getting all the details to kind of build up this decision they're going to have to make. But we have to answer the question for ourselves, like, what does the forgiveness of God mean to us? We get the answer of what forgiveness should mean, because by the end of this, they come home, the brothers return home, they tell Jacob about kind of everything they've experienced, like Joseph is still alive, and then like he wants you to come to the land of Goshen in Egypt, right? And we're told towards the end, right, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Right, all we've talked about the spirit of Jacob was about the sorrow, the brokenness, going down to Sheol, that like his spirit was slowly creeping closer and closer and closer to death. But it is through the forgiveness of Jacob on his brothers and themselves and coming back that his spirit is revived. Forgiveness leads to life rather than death. Oftentimes, it requires us to die to something, because for us to forgive somebody else, we literally have to bear their sin. That's fundamentally what forgiveness is. But it always leads to life. We've all had chances where we've been forgiven. We've had to forgive other people. Right? And a lot of times it clears the air. Right? It allows for redemption. It allows for growth. It takes the shackles off of death, and it provides life. Right? And just as Jacob's spirit is revived through forgiveness, our spirit is revived through forgiveness. Right? Forgiveness on the cross is the reason we have life. We can experience the Spirit of God, the identity of God, and we can live with confidence in eternal life. And so Jacob's going to head out for Egypt to the land of Goshen, but he has one final kind of conversation with God. And God says, right, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go back with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you back. This is kind of twofolded of we're going to wrap up the life of Jacob. Jacob personally, when he dies, will be returned to the promised land out of Egypt. But this is also for the Israelite people as a whole, right? We're moving into Exodus. We know that the Israelite people are going to end up in slavery there until the plagues and God comes to rescue them through the Red Sea. All right, don't be afraid to go down. I will make you into a great nation there. Right, the Israelite people, right, for us outside of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, a lot of people cling to the Exodus as like the defining moment of the Israelite people. Right, God speaks to the Israelites all throughout the Old Testament of I am Yahweh, your God, who led you out of Egypt. Right, that is like the defining moment of rescue and forgiveness. That will happen. That's what he's going to make them into a great nation, right, and bring you back. So obviously it's going to happen with a lot of time in between, but we're going to get this again because what God tells Moses when Moses asks like all of his questions, the last one is, well, how am I going to know when we're kind of been delivered? And God says, you're standing on this mountain. I will bring you back to this mountain. I will bring you into Egypt. I will bring you out of Egypt. And I will bring you back right here. And so they're gonna go to Goshen. Right? Goshen, fuller version of Gone. We're gonna get a lot of representations of the Garden of Eden here. Jacob is invited to come down and taste the fruits of the garden, right? To enjoy of Goshen. He's going to enjoy a physical, kind of fuller root of garden. And we all know what happened with the fruit in the garden, right? That's where God was going to provide for his people. But here's the more important part. This all happens in exile, right? They have to go down into Egypt. Joseph is already in Egypt. The land of Goshen is in Egypt. The garden that we're going to talk about as Goshen is in the place of exile, not the promised land. Egypt, through all of the food, the provision of Joseph, through the years of abundance into the years of exile, it becomes a temporary Eden where God will bless the nations through his people, right? It is the work of Joseph that is blessing all of the nations. This idea that Eden is everywhere and anywhere, right, representing the omnipresence of God. Omnipresence is just it's a theological kind of doctrinal word. It just means that God is present everywhere at all times. Kind of like the sovereignty in a way of God. All right, Eden is everywhere. We live post-resurrection Christians. The Holy Spirit has been descended upon us and into us that we live with the presence of God anywhere and everywhere. That's what we're talking about here, is we can experience the garden, we can experience the Holy Spirit, the presence of God, even in exile. And what Jacob says much later, right, is I'm ready to die now because I've seen your face and you are still alive. He's gone to Egypt. He's come face to face with Joseph. Right? He's ready to die because he's received forgiveness. We know our reward is no longer in exile here in the physical world that we live in, but it is with God. Right? Remember Jacob, right? He doesn't say, because I've seen your face and you're still alive. He doesn't say straight up, I've seen the face of God, but I think we know what he means. Right? Because Jacob wrestled with God when he was embraced by Esau. He says, I've seen the face of God. I feel like I've seen the face of God. He's seen the face of God symbolically, right, for the third time. He is experiencing all of these things of what, like the wrestle with God and then the absolute forgiveness from Esau. that comes really only from knowing God. Right? And then here, right, just watching the progression of Joseph and thinking he's dead, but getting to see him again. All right, and Joseph is with his brothers, right, and tells them, right, you are shepherds, right, you also raise livestock. So when Pharaoh comes, right, say that your servants, they've raised livestock from their youth until now, then you'll be allowed to settle in the land of Goshen, since all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians. All right, we talked about this very briefly last time about shepherds and kind of all the bad examples of shepherds and why Jesus has to claims to be the good shepherd, but also, right, why shepherds are just detestable to Egyptians. Part of it was the sacrifice and consumption of cattle and livestock, but part of it is just geographically of the Israelites, and shepherds are hill people. Egyptians are kind of land people in a way. If you look around, just, I mean, even the United States, like different geographical regions and people in those regions, there's different ways of life. And that obviously results in a lot of opinions, but just different ways of life and certain people accepting and certain things and other ways of life seeming detestable. We get this today. We understand it. It's kind of just what it is. And so by telling them you'll raise livestock, right, Pharaoh won't take the brothers and put them to work kind of in other parts of the country because they're shepherds, they raise livestock. They're going to keep them together in the land of Goshen. They'll kind of, in a way, be isolated together. One, the temptation to intermarry would not be there. So you would not have Israelite people intermarrying with non-Yahweh devoted followers because they would be marrying Egyptian women. But also just all the Israelite people staying in the land of Goshen allows them to keep their distinctiveness. And Pharaoh actually tells them, right, settle in the best part of the land. Right, so they're shepherds. Part of this has to do with water access of the land of Goshen was very well watered for shepherds and livestock, but it is where God has ordained them to be. So I think just being in that presence of God with other God-following people would result for us thinking it's the best part of the land. So Pharaoh and Jacob meet, and Jacob says to Pharaoh, "My pilgrimage has lasted 130 years. My years have been few and hard." I'd love, it's the CSB translation, but this idea of Jacob says, "My pilgrimage." Like, if that doesn't describe just our lives, I don't really know what. Our life is a pilgrimage. It is a journey out of exile into the promised land. We journey with God. So Jacob describes his years as few and hard. I think we understand why Jacob says his years are hard. All right, he deceives Esau. He flees to Laban. Everything that happened there, all the deception there, this just fleeing from Esau for all these years. He meets them, then all the problems with his wives and the 4 wives and the jealousy and the barrenness. Then he loses Joseph, or he thinks. Then he has this idea he's going to lose Benjamin. Simeon's kept in prison. Like, nothing seemingly has gone, in a way, right for Jacob. His family around him has caused him plenty of problems. I think we too would describe our lives as hard and difficult. Now, the few is comparatively speaking, because you're probably thinking 130 years, that's pretty old. He's speaking in comparison to Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, who lived numerically longer years. All right, all of this sounds really good. The Israelite people are absolutely flourishing in life right now. But remember, there is 7 years of famine. And so the famine is so bad that they've run out of silver because, like in America, in our current way of life, you trade money for food. The only problem is they ran out of money. So what they do is Joseph says, all right, well, we'll trade livestock for food. Then they run out of all the livestock, so they start exchanging land for food. right? What you need to be a shepherd is you need a flock and land. And so Joseph is continually providing for his brothers by giving them livestock. He's giving them purpose and a responsibility within the garden, and then also giving them a place to dwell and do those things. Right, God put Adam in the garden to work the land. God has ordained through Joseph for the brothers to be in Goshen to care for the flocks in the land. It's pretty powerful to think how Joseph continually just provides for his brothers. I think at any point we would understand if Joseph just said, all right, I forgive you, but we're done. Right, you're forgiven, but don't bother with me anymore. No, he said, like, come be with me, live with me. I myself will provide for you. The brothers do not deserve this, even in the slightest. We can have a roundtable discussion of everything that the brothers deserve, and this would probably never come up. But if we think about it in our own lives of just the famine of our own souls, and how Jesus exchanged his body and his life so we could have forgiveness, but it is also through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that he provides for us, and we have purpose within the land of God. Right? We're created in the image of God, giving us representation, right, and rule over the land. Joseph is helping his brothers become who God had created them to be, in the same way that, right, it is through our faith in Jesus that we actually step into and live out the purpose that we were created for. How this ends, right, is Joseph continues to provide for Pharaoh too, right? That a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. The people can keep 80%. This could be tithing. Tithing's 20% in this case. But he continues to provide for Pharaoh and keep this good standing. It shows so much about just the faith of Joseph, even in exile, under non-godly leadership. He continues to provide and just do his job so well. And it's actually through that all of this is made possible for his family. And so we switch gears to kind of going then to Jacob's kind of worried about dying. He's getting old, right? And he has this moment with Joseph, where he asks, right, if I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise me that you will deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt when I rest with my ancestors. Carry me away from Egypt and bury me in the burial place. We talked extensively kind of in the Jacob session. Right? Jacob has these moments with God. He wrestles with God. He makes these claims about how God will become his God. There is this progression, but we sit there and we're like, does Jacob fully understand? This, I think he fully understands. It's kind of through sentences like this and sayings of him returning out of exile, don't let me be buried in Egypt, that he understands, and we see the progression of faith. He doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to go back to the land of Canaan, what will be and is the promised land. He wants to be buried with his ancestors, which is in the cave at Machpelah, which is the one thing that Abraham has kind of possession and promise of in the promised land. But remember, they were there, and Jacob flees to Laban, meaning he was perfectly okay to not live there. Hey, it's self-preservation. We understand, we read and know why he left, but it doesn't change the fact that in his heart he was okay from not being in the promised land, and he's gonna end his life in exile. But his plea and his prayer is, don't let me be buried here. Right? Take my bones elsewhere. It is this, he's grasping the idea of, I don't want to be buried in exile amongst the ungodly. I want to be buried and rest, right, in the presence of the godly and the faithful servants. That's what we pray for. That's what we have hope in, right? That we will not be eternally separated from God, right, in hell, but we will be brought into heaven, and we can dwell with the faithful servants and with God himself. All right, and so as we're dying, right, when parents start to die, we get this blessings of the children. And so Joseph, we're told, has two sons. We talked about this, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim is the youngest one. Manasseh is the oldest. And so what we're told is that Jacob takes his right hand and puts it on Ephraim, actually crosses over his hands and puts his left hand on Manasseh. The right hand is figuratively the more powerful, kind of equality, authoritative one. That's what Jesus sits on at the right hand of God. Those kind of things, the right hand just seems to signify more importance. Jacob is through this, right? But he's crossed over, so it's not natural kind of resting position. He's in a way unnaturally blessing the youngest more than the oldest. This is the inversion of the firstborn that we've seen run wild throughout Genesis, of it's going to be the younger son who will be blessed more than the older, even though culturally and societally the oldest would be receive more. Right? But it's unnatural. It's literally Jacob he was the youngest that was blessed. We see how all of that had played out, but it's funny because we're told that Joseph thought it was a mistake, right? And says, no, this is the first one, put your right hand on him. And I love just the details that we get, right? Jacob understands, I think, what God's kind of doing and how he plays a part in this, because he says, I know, son, I know he too will become a tribe and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger will be greater than he. Right? It's this final example of the inversion of the firstborn. And so, right, Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. But what is really, really interesting is that right before he blesses them, right, he says, right, I claim them as my own. He basically kind of tries to adopt them. Right? And he says, they belong to me the same way that Reuben and Simeon do. Like this idea of the inversion of the firstborn, right, is extended more, right, because Joseph was like the 11th born, and he was going to become the greatest. Why does Jacob do this, right? Jacob loved Rachel, obviously. So he views Joseph as the firstborn. Joseph was the firstborn to the one he loved the most, so the firstborn would receive this double portion. And so Joseph is being viewed and blessed as the firstborn by receiving the double portion of inheritance through his two sons. And Jacob even says again, right, I've never expected to see your face again, but now God has even let me see your offspring. Right, Jacob has gone into exile. He's ran his whole life, but he has seen the face of Joseph like the face of God. And even his grandchildren, he's seen generational fruit. Pretty interesting. But what we get next is it just complicates a lot of these questions that we've talked about. Jacob goes on, right, and he blesses all 12 of his sons. And Joseph's two sons, right? Jacob just handed out 14 blessings. This question, it always remains, and I don't think we're going to have an answer to it. And I brought this up when we talked about Isaac and Esau and Jacob and the blessing and all that. That Jacob stole Esau's blessing, and Esau always keeps asking, like, why don't you just have an extra one? Or don't you have an extra one for me? It's a wonderful question Jacob just gave 14 blessings. Why didn't Esau have a second one? Right? The answer then, and I still think the answer now, is just Isaac was deceived. It was deception that he couldn't bless his other son, but this question gets magnified in context like this, where Jacob blesses all 12 of his sons and 2 grandsons. Genesis 50. This is our last chapter in this study, so we'll finish strong. But this is going to be the end of the book of Genesis. Jacob asks to be basically buried in the cave at Machpelah. That's where everybody else is buried. I kind of hit on this already, but his prayer is, in death, take me out of exile and back into the promised land. Right? That is our prayer of, when I die, right, God, through my faith in you, through faith in Jesus, right, take me out of exile, out of the physical death of this world, right, and take me back into the promised land, perfect relationship in God's presence. Jacob does die. We are told he is embalmed. And the Egyptians even mourn him. Right, and so this is the family of Joseph. Joseph treated Pharaoh so well that the Egyptians actually have so much respect for Joseph and his family. Right, and so embalmment is partially a sign of respect and like royalty, and so this kind of shows you the view of Joseph in Egypt. But secondly, right, it's not like today's world where you just hop in a car and drive places, or take a plane and fly places. Right, to go from Egypt back to the land of Canaan and the cave of Machpelah, it was going to take time. And so Jacob is embalmed because he could not be buried right away. Could be a happy ending. Right, but the brothers are absolutely just ridden with fear. Right, if Joseph is holding a grudge, like if he's kind of faking this whole thing, right, now that Dad's dead, he's certainly going to repay us. Right, and so they send kind of this message to Joseph, like, before he died, right, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph: please forgive your brothers transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came. Right, they kind of like, they're going to send this message of, hey, Dad said you should forgive us. Right? I think they're trying to cover themselves because they're so scared Joseph's going to flip on them, right, and take them out now that their father's dead. The faith of Joseph is explained in these two statements that he responds with. The first, right, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? This is the same thing that Joseph said, I think, when Pharaoh basically brings him in and says, interpret my dreams. Joseph's like, it's not me who's going to interpret your dream, because this divination, this idea of knowledge from God, only comes from God. Joseph is refusing to enact either the blessings or the curses of God under his own power. Right? Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams was the way out of prison. It was the way for Joseph to get back on track and make his own. But he knew that knowledge was a blessing only comes from God, and he was not going to enact that himself to save himself. Same place here. Joseph has a chance to bring about the curse and the judgment of God on his own power. These brothers do not deserve forgiveness. Their father's dead. He can do whatever he wants to. But he's not going to enact the curse and the judgment of God under his own power. He will trust that it will be what it will be in the kingdom of God, but he is not in the place of God to hurt his brothers. All right, and what he says next, right, you planned evil against me, God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid, and I'll take care of you and your children. Right, God planned it for good to bring about the survival of many. Right, if you look at the disciples kind of pleading when Jesus says, it's my time, right, I'm going to go away. Like the pleading, like, no. Right, but Jesus knows, right, God planned it for good to bring about the survival of many. What seems so bad is oftentimes what God uses to display his goodness. And then we come to know him on a much, much deeper level. Right, for Joseph, right, he was the anointed one who was given the dreams and the prophecies, endures suffering the hands of his brother, enters exile into the prison in the region of Egypt. He's redeemed into glory to the house in the court of Pharaoh, and he provides survival for the nations, literally by his handling of the famine. This is the parallel to Jesus, the suffering servant. He is the anointed one of God who endured suffering, even to death on a cross, entered exile, he entered the grave, faced death, was redeemed into glory through the resurrection and ascension into heaven. And it is the faith in Jesus that provides survival for the nations, that we can live eternally. There's so many crossovers here. I think I said it in the last video, starting Joseph. Understanding Abraham and Joseph, their two stories and the characters, and just their relationships with the Lord, helps me understand Jesus a lot better. It connected a lot of pieces and opened my eyes to a lot of things. So that's kind of why I hit Abraham very heavily. And also Joseph was split into two parts because there's so many connections here that lead us into the Exodus, which gives us a clear picture of the cross. So I'm hoping you see these connections. This helped me a lot in my faith, and I hope it has done the same for you, or at least encouraged you a little bit. All right, but we're gonna end in death because we're told that Joseph is about to die. We are actually told eventually Joseph does die. It's actually the last verse of Genesis, right? That Joseph dies at 110 years of age. If you do the math, right, he was sold and went out into the field with his brothers at 17. 93 years he spent in exile. A lot of times if God doesn't show up within like 45 minutes, I think we're ready to give up. If anything from the book of Genesis, right, I hope you've seen the perseverance and the pilgrimage of faith. All right, Jacob describes his life as a pilgrimage of few and hard years. We're not here for a long time, and certainly we face a lot of suffering and trials. We have hard years, and in the scope of human history, they're short and they're few. But the book of Genesis is about endurance, about God creating a world that we still live in, sin that still affects us, the promise of Abraham that extends to Jesus and now to us, even with Joseph, right? All of the characters we've seen, their faith is tested, and it is like lifelong journeys. Jacob's journey was lifelong. Abraham's journey, God called him to something and said, "You're not even going to receive anything." And Abraham said, "I'll keep going." Joseph leaves at 17, or he's taken at 17. Spends 93 years in exile, and the faith of that guy is remarkable. To understand the whole way, I spent 93 years in exile, but I spent 93 years under the provision of God. I spent 93 years allowing God to write his plan over my life. Can the same be said for us whenever we leave? Whether it's 2 years, 3 years, whenever we leave this earth, and however long we've walked with the Lord, can we say that even in exile, in a sinful, broken world that we live in, I lived it under the ordination and obedience to God? Joseph can say it. And I hope that we hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," because I'm sure those are the words that Joseph heard. Right before Joseph does die, right, he says to his brothers, right, "I'm about to die. God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land that he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Right, when God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. One final idea of take me out of exile and put me back in the promised land. I want to be buried, right? Take my bones, take my soul, take my body into the promised land, into the presence of God, because he's coming to your aid. Don't leave me here. Right, the bodies of the Old Testament saints will be resurrected at the end of the tribulation period. So the physical bodies and the physical bones will literally be resurrected, taken out of exile, of death and the grave, and into heaven. And this does happen. Joseph's bones are carried out of Egypt, but it only happens many, many years later. In Exodus chapter 13, as they are on the way out of Egypt, they're about to go to the Red Sea. We're told that Moses picks up the bones of Joseph. And so Joseph's bones will only leave exile once God rescues his people. Right, the Old Testament bodies, our bodies, will be resurrected and leave exile at the end of the tribulation period. All right, what we're going to wrap up with is kind of the big picture of Genesis and the big picture of Joseph, which I think leads into the big picture of Exodus, which gives us the scope for the whole Bible, which is kind of was the whole goal of this class. In Hebrews 11, we're told that by faith Joseph mentioned the Exodus. It is by faith Joseph talks about the rescue of his people. It is by faith. We do this study and we read the Bible and we talk about God. It's by faith that we mention our rescue from God. And the two kind of overarching themes all throughout Joseph, all throughout Genesis, all throughout Scripture. When we die outside of Eden, which we all will, our only hope is to ascend back into it. Right, when we are born and we die outside of perfect relationship with God, our only hope is through the anointed one who suffered, Jesus, that we can ascend back into the perfect presence and garden of God. We can ascend back into heaven, right, whether that is before the return of Jesus, right, or we get to experience the new heaven and the new earth. Right, and the last part here is kind of the big picture just to take with us. Of resurrection is the only proper homecoming to death and exile. We have died. We've been a slave to sin. We've been taken into exile, out of relationship with God. It is through the resurrection of Jesus that is the only proper way and the only way we can, right, come back into the presence of God, to know God and to live eternally with him. It's the same for Joseph. As the resurrection out of prison, out of the pit. For Joseph, the resurrection out of the ground of Egypt, out of exile, back into the promised land. And it's through faith that we will return once again in our own lives to the promised land. And that is the book of Genesis. I thank you very, very much for going through these sessions, for taking the time to read Genesis, to study the Word with me. I hope you have learned something, that the Lord has used this to grow your relationship with Him, and just a deeper understanding of why we read the Bible so intricately. We care about the words, we care about the details, because it was all inspired by God through human hands, but it is the story that God has wrote for His redemption of His people. So I thank you. I'd love to just know your feedback on what you thought. There may be more to come of stuff like this in the future, but for now, this is the end of the book of Genesis and the study of Genesis in the beginning. So as you go, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make His face shine upon you. God bless, and just thank you for joining me on this journey.